Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Siddharth Tripathi. I'm a senior research fellow at University of Erfurt, and I lead a project called Post-Colonial Hierarchies in Peace and Conflict. First of all, I would congratulate Kamal for bringing all this fantastic group of people and also the panelists here together. It's always very nice to see when some of the ideas that we discuss in classrooms, and Kamal was a former student of mine, but also a co-traveler now, when those ideas take fruition outside the classroom. And it's a very proud moment for me to see this happening, and congratulations, Kamal, once again. In this panel, we'll be talking about reimagining the Middle East amid geopolitical recalibrations. And we all know the global order is unraveling, probably for the better. The transition from a unipolar to a multipolar world is also accelerating fragmentation, intensifying conflicts, and exposing the fragility of long-standing institutions. Layered atop this geopolitical turbulence is a compounding polycrisis: economic volatility, rampant inflation, food insecurity, climate emergencies, enduring humanitarian crisis, and not to forget the genocide going on in Gaza, and deepening global inequalities that converge to produce systemic instability that defies traditional solutions and conventional wisdom. Amidst this upheaval, emerging powers and actors, also from the global south, which had long been considered peripheral, marginal, are asserting unprecedented influence, challenging the dominance of northern and western liberal discourses. These actors are not merely reacting to the global order, they are also actively reshaping it, asserting agency in agenda setting and contesting structures which are rooted in racial capitalism, neo-imperialism, and also entrenched hierarchies. Their rise signals a profound reconfiguration of power, identity, and legitimacy in international politics. The Middle East is not untouched and unaffected by these changes. It exemplifies and also amplifies these global transformations. The region is simultaneously a site of war and fragile peace, authoritarian entrenchment, but also grassroots uprising, while entrenched nationalism, but also on the other side, emergent social movements, all within shifting regional and global alignments. These dynamics are reshaping state-society relations, recalibrating regional power balances, and redefining the struggle for democracy, rights, and inclusion through solidarities. In the panel brings together a lot of these critical perspectives from peace negotiations, resource and climate politics, nationalism, gender equality, and grassroots mobilization to interrogate these transformations. It seeks to move beyond just a descriptive analysis, but also envisions, hopefully, new frameworks for understanding power, resistance, and cooperation in an era marked by uncertainty, upheaval, but also possibilities. By exploring intersections of local and global, systemic and human, the discussion aims to imagine pathways towards a more just, democratic, and inclusive future for the region and the world. I'll quickly introduce the speakers. So we have a fantastic group of speakers. 4 of them are here, 1 is online. First, we have Cengiz Çandar. He's a veteran Turkish journalist, senior columnist, and Middle East expert. He has been a journalist since 1976, serving as a member of Turkey Parliament and authored 7 books in Turkish. His recent work, Turkey's Mission Impossible, War and Peace with Kurds, is a landmark study. He has also been a distinguished visiting scholar at Stockholm University and a senior associate fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Such pleasure to be here with you. We also have Professor Abbas Wali, who is a Kurdish political theorist from Mahabad, Iran, and one of the foremost scholars on Kurdish identity and nationalism. He studied in Tehran and London, earning his PhD in historical sociology from the University of London, and later taught at Swansea University and Bogazici University in Istanbul. He was also the founding president of the University of Kurdistan in Hivler. His works include essays on the origins of Kurdish nationalism and Kurds and the state in Iran, the making of Kurdish identity. We also have with us Dr. Shilan Fuad Hussain. She is a Kurdish scholar of gender and politics. She has been a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow, a visiting fellow at the Washington Kurdish Institute, and a doctoral fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. She holds a PhD in cultural analysis from the University of Urbino, and has served as an editor and consultant on gender issues with Brill, Routledge, and other places. Right next to me is Rohin Mukriyan. Rohin Mukriyan is PhD candidate in government and politics at University College Cork, Ireland. I just was informed that she'd be soon finishing it very, very early. Her research in political theory and Middle Eastern politics with a focus on Kurdish politics has been published in really amazing journals including International Political Theory, Philosophy and Social Criticism, and Theoria. Last but not the least, we have Dr. Joost Jongerden, who is online. He is Associate Professor of Rural Sociology at Wageningen University in Netherlands. His research bridges sociology, political science, and conflict studies with a focus on forced migration, rural development, and Kurdish political movements. He is co-editor of Kurdish Studies and widely published on Kurdish society and radical democracy. I stop speaking here and I give the floor to Cengiz Çandar. He will address the lessons of Turkey's past peace talks with the Kurds and how today's regional dynamics, from war in the Middle East to shifting alliances, may shape the future of Turkey-Kurdish relations and Ankara's ties with its neighbors.
Thank you. Well, first, I have to say that I am very, very grateful to be here, invited by Kemal Çomani, which I haven't met in person some years back, but I have always been a keen follower of him in social media and that I admired a lot. So I'm happy to be associated for an initiative. He's connected, and now I am feeling that I'm being a part of it. So I'm grateful for the invitation. And when I received the invitation under the title Reimagining the Middle East amid recalibration of geopolitics, for me it encapsulated what I stood for many decades. It was as if the code word for my entire career. If I wouldn't be invited for such an event under the title Reimagining the Middle East amid geopolitical recalibration, I would feel offended. I'm happy to be part of this endeavor here. And if I wouldn't be here and miss Bakhtiar Ali's opening speech, it would really be such a negativity in my life, because as a person who had spent some years of his adult life in exile, I wouldn't be touched more than what he has ever said on to be an exile and what exile is. So by this start, let me get into the issue. The Middle East, when we were talking about reimagining the Middle East, I have to remind you that the Middle East, until now you didn't hear me at all? Because I forgot already what I said earlier. So anyway, so the Middle East had never been a geographic concept. It was, from the very, very beginning, it has been a geopolitical concept. It's not a name of a geography. It's a geopolitical concept by itself, nothing to do with the definition of geography. And it is a colonialist invented concept, actually. For Churchill, for example, for Winston Churchill, the Middle East was the region around Iran. Iran was the center of the region because the east was India. Far east was further than India. It is China and Japan. And Near East was where Suez Canal is. So middle of all these east according to London, has been the Middle East. Then came the American geopolitical big thinker, Admiral Mahan, Alfred Mahan. For him, Middle East is the middle of three continents, Asia, Europe, and Africa, that connects them through straits. So in his seminal work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, which defined the geopolitical significance of what he termed as Middle East. It was the aim and target of the colonialist and post-colonialist politics. So today's Middle East map is designed as the European colonialist powers envisage the demise of the Ottoman Empire by the division of the region and the creation of new nation states. As is known, the outcome of the secret Sykes-Picot Treaty. That had been a historic and geopolitical anomaly since then, and by the 21st century, since we had a quarter of it is already gone, it proved to be unworkable. Look what has happened in Syria, in Iraq, elsewhere. So this feature defines today's multiple problems in the region. The Middle East in the post-World War I, how it was designed. So to speak, we can enlist two main characteristics of the Middle East. Its first characteristic is the predominance of the maritime powers. You can translate it in your minds as the colonialist, the French and the British, of course. And the French, they just imported from the British. For them, it is Moyen-Orient and Proche-Orient, Middle East and the Near East. But if you go even back to Louis XIV, the name Levant is given, and Levant is not the British area. It is designed to be under the control of the French. So Levant is today's Syria and somewhat Palestine and Transjordan, and then north of it, Aleppo region and Lival Iskenderun, as Arabs call it, the Hatay province of today's Turkey. So this is Levant. What Levant comes from, it is the translation of, into French, of Maghrib and Mashriq in Arabic. Maghrib means where the sun sets, the further end of the North Africa, and Mashriq is where sun rises. So the French word love, to rise, took the shape of Levant, and when French speak of Levant, they speak of Syria and its environs, and then comes the word Levantine, which has an important connotation in Ottoman languages. So that means the Middle East had been the epicenter of Anglo-French rivalry, two maritime powers, for a long period, and then it has taken by, in the post-Second World War, by Americans and to a certain extent by Soviets. So it has always been a geopolitical zone of the rivalry and the competition of the powers outside of the region. Therefore, any slightest local conflict is consequently immediately recovered and instrumentalized by external powers. Syria, Yemen, Israel, Palestine. The struggle between these powers were not lonely among those powers. They acted as proxies of external forces, whether it's French, whether it is British, whether it's American, whether it's Soviet, whatever. And so this is the second characteristic of the region, seeing proxies and looking from the angle of proxy wars. Anything in the Middle East, what happens, is interpreted as a proxy war, or as through the proxies, as the struggle of the external powers. From the post-Second World period and on, the main features, particularly in the post-Cold War, by 90s, it is Islam and energy as two main elements entered into the equation. So with the post-Cold War, the concept Greater Middle East is introduced by the Americans. It meant from Morocco to Afghanistan. It is the Greater Middle East. So introducing democracy, suppressing political Islam had been the main American concern for the time being. And gradually, the epicenter of this geopolitical zone, what is called as the Middle East, moved to the Gulf region. In my youth, as a member of 68th generation, when we have spoken of the Middle East, the immediate thing that came to our mind is Israel, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt. Today, the epicenter of Middle East is no more in this region. It is the Gulf. Between the Gulf and the Suez Canal, that is the epicenter of the region. It has some imperatives to understand what's going on today. In this area, there are 6 countries led by MBS, Mohammed bin Salman's Saudi Arabia. They possess this area about a quarter of the world oil and natural gas reserves, and Saudi Arabia by itself is the world regulator of oil prices. So this brings us to the initiatives of external powers and the importance of what we hear frequently about this Abraham Accords, which was implemented, and it has been the creation of the first Trump period. Abraham Accords meant to be normalization of relations between the Gulf states and Israel. With the new epicenter of the Middle East, through peaceful relations with Israel, and if we just resort to our memories, the Gaza war on 7th of October 2023 started when Saudi Arabia was expected to be a party to the Abraham Accords, following United Arab Emirates and others. If you allow me 3 more minutes, I can go into the Turkish peace process. So, even in the Turkish parliament, when the time is over, it's automatically cut, the microphone, but sometimes the speaker lets us to speak further. So I hope this place is more democratic than the Turkish parliament. So what happened? By 2023, in the new Middle East, by the Gaza war, it is more than the war by Israel against the Palestinians of Gaza. Because it is still going on, the war didn't stop. It meant crushing political Islam, which appeared in the post-Cold War period, and to control all the energy lanes in the Middle East. And to do it, it went up to crushing axis of resistance, which was led by Iran, therefore pushing any kind of possibility of Russia, China, Iran influence and axis dysfunctional. So in this last 3 years, Israel emerged as the main hegemon of the region by force, and it's still going on. So Iran is out, Syria collapsed, Hezbollah, Hamas, all non-state actors are out of equation. This led by itself Turkey to emerge as a counter-power center alongside Saudi Arabia in the region against Israel. Here comes the Kurdish element into the equation. Kurds, relatively a non-existent and rather a weak geopolitical actor in defining moments of the region following World War I and World War II, emerge in the stage of history as a fresh, dynamic, and to be considered as a geopolitical actor. 3 things indicate this new Kurdish phenomenon, which we haven't seen. The Kurdish people existed. Kurdish identity, Kurdish ethnicity existed, but Kurds did not exist as a geopolitical factor. Three things: post-Gulf War, 1991, and the war on Iraq, which made Kurdistan federal region to emerge. Number two, the Kurdish insurgency that proved a permanent pain in Turkey. It went on for 41 years in a NATO member country. And the third, the civil war in Iraq and the creation of autonomous administration in north and northeast of Syria, or Qassad, if you will call it, or if you call it SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces. So the recalibration of geopolitics in the region has to be understood and assessed within this context, the emergence of Kurdish element. So the natural contention and the potential contention between Turkey and Israel, I use Turkey because like Burkina Faso has replaced Upper Volta or Myanmar, Burma, Turkey replaces now Turkey. So let's go as Turkey, as recognized by United Nations. So a natural contention between Turkey and Israel with the demise of Arab nationalism and relatively political Islam, and as Iran battered. So we have to understand that this new initiative of peace process in Turkey. How many minutes are here? 1 minute, okay. So the contention over Syria, the hidden contention, by proxy elements in Syria is between Turkey and Israel, and that is the reason that the peace initiative is initiated by the Turkish decision makers. Just 2 days ago, day before yesterday, in this parliamentary commission, which is taking up this issue, the last speaker was the chairman of the National Intelligence Academy, the think tank of National Intelligence Department, MIT, in Turkey. So MIT is the leading agency of this peace process. He said, it's in Turkish, but I'm simultaneously translating. He said that Turkey has a unique resolution and peace model. The developments we passed through in the Middle East and the geopolitical transformation created new security risks for Turkey, and the border, the frontiers in the region, which was drawn 100 years ago, is being erased to be replaced with the new ones. And what we see, new ideas and new projects are in competition to be implemented in the region. Therefore, we have to see the process that Turkey is in within this context. So when we come to the peace process in Turkey, we need to see the situation of the Kurdish problem within the new concept of and the new context, the geopolitical context of the Middle East, where we witness a potential competition between Israel and Turkey wants to enlist the Kurds in its own way, not to give the Kurdish element to Israel in order to be an eternal problem for Turkey in itself. So, as last words, I have to underline that in the social media, particularly, I noticed in the last months that there is an emergence of independentist Kurdish ideas, very pro-Israeli, saying that the Kurdish movement has arrived. We have Israel as the dominant force, and this Israel is with all the minorities, as we see with the Druze in Israel, and why not us with the Kurds? So let us ally with Israel for our future to get an independent state of Kurds in Syria or elsewhere. This is dangerous. The time is over, so I leave it to the question-answer period if you will have one. We shouldn't neglect that we are living in a Trumpian world. And this world, as Larry Summers, one of the former Secretary of Treasury of United States, was speaking of American economy, even a drunken driver can reach its destination, meaning Trump. You have a drunken driver now at the helm of the world. Mr. Trump is drunk. The problem, we don't know the destination. We know the driver is drunk without knowing what the destination is. Destination ahead of us, particularly in the region of the Middle East, is chaotic and uncertain. So we have to navigate as Turkey, as Kurds, as others in the region towards an unknown and uncertain destination with full of risks and opportunities will come what they are in the later part of the meeting. Thank you.
We have Dr. Shilat Fuad Hussain now. She'll analyze how war and geopolitical transformations in the Middle East, now I should say within quotes, shape women's lives and political roles.
Thank you. Before I begin, I want to say that it is an honor to be here today, to be part of the launching of the Amargi and among these great esteemed speakers, particularly in this current time, climate where reliable and censored information from the Middle East is so badly needed, and especially the perspectives of women, which I have been asked to address with my remarks today. It is undeniable that the Middle East is experiencing a period of upheaval and transition. Some of this is authentic, indigenous uprising against the authoritarianism which has plagued the region for decades. Other aspects are societal collapse because of outside imperial interventions as world powers aim to exert their hegemony over the region and its vast oil wealth. Moreover, because of the centralized location of the Middle East places it at heart of various desired once did. But within all these geopolitical chess game, one group finds itself intersectionally victimized from outside powers and from their own families within, and that is the region's woman. The precarious position of women means that even if they escape being victims to dictators, religious clerics, or repressive laws, they may still be just as equally oppressed from their husbands, brothers, or even mothers and aunts who conspire against them in the hopes the patriarchy will spare them as a reward for their collaboration. Some of these scourges include three areas I spent a great deal of time researching in the field as part of my Maria Curie postdoctoral fellowship and termed the patriarchal trifecta. This trio includes female genital mutilation, forced marriages, and honor killings, with my interviews revealing how they oftentimes operate in conjunction with one another. What this trifecta displays is how women's agency can literally be controlled from the day they are born, and that sense of control and ownership over their body will stretch until they can forcibly hand it over the control of another man through marriage, with the murder from the male relatives acting as an open threat to women who offend their male relatives with their behavior until then. But the geopolitical map of the Middle East is also ripe with sprouting flowers of resistance from the women who have decided that they do not want to be controlled by centralized state ruler or an overbearing man in their home. One of the most notably is obvious, the Xinjiang Azadi revolution rooted in the beating death of Jina Amini by Iran's morality police. This uprising in eastern Kurdistan and wider Iran is captured by Western world's attention as many women began defying mandatory hijab and using the simple acts of showing their hair as a symbolic denial of mullah authorities. In nearby Western Kurdistan and northeastern Syria, you have also had the Rojava Revolution, which saw the brave women of YPG, Women's Protection Units, inspire the world as they helped defeat ISIS and liberate Yazidi women who had been enslaved by the deranged caliphate. Likewise, throughout Turkey and the areas of northeastern Kurdistan, women have been the primary voices for democracy and establishing a civil society, as tens of thousands of people have been imprisoned under Turkish state that sees both Kurdish cultural rights and women and emancipation as threats to the ultra-conservative society they wish to construct. And rounding out the Kurdistan map, in southern Kurdistan and Iraq, women have found themselves as the forefront of a society in transition where the modern amenities of Kurdish cities have yet to match the modern rise of women, self-agency, and where women confront tribal norms, societal customs that teach young girls and women that their value is solely in the home. As a result, the public sphere, which has been the arena primarily for men, is now facing challenges by women who want to have careers and pursue their dreams in life. In doing so, we find an interesting dichotomy where Kurdish men who fought for so long for an autonomous homeland find their literal home living rooms as new arena of occupation. And oftentimes, the roles have been reversed with the husband as the new Saddam. Outside of Kurdish areas, you are also seeing women's issues shake up the regions as women of Saudi Arabia now legally drive cars, while the women of the Gulf states rightfully expect the economic boom creating modern buildings will coincide with more modern ideas of what it means to be a free woman. With regards to the rights of women in the Middle East, as researchers and journalists, I would call on all of us, both women and men, to always ask the question, have I equally considered women in my story? Oftentimes, the male position becomes the default as mankind and humanity come to represent their trials and tribulations. As I move to close, let us remember that the story of women in the Middle East is not one of silence, but of voices long submerged beneath the noise of war, state building, the pursuit of power. Women have not been absent from the geopolitical map. They have been unacknowledged cartographers, drawing new lines of resistance, reshaping the contours of kinship and community, and reminding us that the most durable forms of sovereignty begin not with the sword, but with the capacity to nurture life, preserve memory, and imagine futures beyond violence. The geopolitical role of women is too often reduced to metaphor or symbol. The nation as the mother, the land as daughter, honor inscribed upon the body. Yet to remain with such imaginary is to obscure women's material agency. Women have carried weapons, negotiated peace, led protest, governed in exile, and sustained the daily infrastructure of survival when the states have collapsed. They embody endurance, the stubborn insistence that life continues even amidst dispossessions and war. This is not to romanticize suffering, but to recognize power amidst this, where we are trained not to see it. The veil, the home, the body, these have been read as sites of oppression, but they are also fields of negotiation where global ideology. It is in this spirit that I conclude by asking, what does the struggle of Kurdish women demand of us? At the very last, it demands that we bear witness. It requires that we tell their stories, amplifying their voices in a world that too often silences them. But more than that, it calls us to action. It challenges us to dismantle the system of oppression in our communities, to fight for gender equality, not as an abstract ideal, but as a lived reality. Kurdish women have shown us what is possible when courage meets conviction, when feminism becomes not just a theory, but a practice, a way of life. They have taught us that liberation is not a destination, but a journey, one that requires us to walk together, hand in hand, towards a future where every woman, everywhere, can live free. That is the true essence of Xinjiang Azadi. Thank you.
Thank you for this really interesting intervention and also keeping with time. We have Professor Wali now who will explore the future of Iran with particular attention to the Kurdish question in Iran.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking my colleagues in Amargi for making this event possible, for bringing us together, and also starting a new path towards their own objective in the media and so on. Very honorable, very good, and I commend them and congratulate them. And I hope they will succeed in their endeavors, and I hope they will achieve their objective. As to the topic of the discussion in the context of reimagining the Middle East, the focal point of my discussion is supposed to be Iran, and of course in the context of Iran, the Kurdish question. This is a tall order in 15 minutes, but I'll try to come into as much as I can in the given time. Insofar as Iran and the Middle East are concerned, there have been two events which Cengiz referred to them. One is obviously October 7, 23, and the other one is June 14, 25. The first one is the Al-Aqsa storm, which opened the can of worms, so to speak, and it led to sea changes, which are undeniable. One of them, as was mentioned, is the emergence of Israel as, I would say, a proxy hegemon, rather than the hegemon, a proxy hegemon. But that is an undeniable thing. The other one is absolutely serious decline of Iran's influence in the region by losing all its proxy powers in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Palestine. Now the only one which is left and which is active is Houthis in Yemen. So Iran's basically wings were seriously clipped, and it was pushed back. But this is, in a sense, the story as we read in the newspapers. The question, however, is this, that like every war, the event of war creates its own narratives. Some of them overlap, some of them conflict. And in terms of Iran-Israeli war, the so-called 12-day war, there are two narratives. One narrative can be encapsulated in this, that everything is different, but nothing has changed. Right? The second narrative is this, that nothing is different, but there are colossal changes. Now, these are two fundamental narratives around which a lot of discourse is being shunted about and written. And where does the truth lie? This is the issue in question, whether there are a lot of, everything is different, but nothing has changed, or there are the amazing changes despite the fact that there are no visible difference. I tend to agree with the second account. I believe that insofar as the structure and working of powers is concerned in Iran, there have been fundamental changes, and more changes are coming. But these changes are coming in a situation where power has, in a sense, been seriously damaged. If I want to use a social science or political scientific term, I would say that the apparatuses of the state have been seriously damaged. But the state power is intact. This is the paradox which tells us that there are no visible differences, but there are a lot of changes. Now the situation is this, that this paradox tells us that why this happened and how this happened. It also takes us back to the, or at least takes me back to the, what this strategic war which was fought against Iran, America and Israel. For the first time, we saw that their objectives regarding dealing with Iran coincided with each other. Previously, it was not the case. Israel wanted to engage in a war with Iran, but the American administration under Biden, or even former the first Trump administration and before that Obama, the American administration did not want this war. And this allowed Iran to skillfully play a strategic game. And that game was this. It has been always said, it is, if you pay attention to Khamenei's saying, it's always that there will not be any war and there will not be any negotiation. The fact that Khamenei was banking on the fact that there will be no war, therefore no negotiation is needed, because he's banking on this difference between Israel and America regarding military solution to the Iranian problem. But after the October 7th, the ground shifted, and shifted in favor of Israel, particularly when Trump came to power. It shifted, and when it shifted, their interest in, or rather their strategic reading or strategic approach to this situation, to the Iranian question, coincided with one another. The strategy that Iran had used for about 8 years, collapsed overnight. It collapsed, and Israel and America attacked Iran. But here again, the difference arose here. And it takes me to the puzzle that why there are no differences but lot of changes. The attack on Iran was very concrete. Very, very concrete. It was this that the idea was to attack Iranian nuclear facilities, to undermine Iran's military structure as much as they could, to undermine Iran's security structure, but leave Iran's internal domestic security forces intact. This was the puzzle that why Basij was not attacked. Yeganhay Vijay, which is the special force, anti-riot forces, which they devastated the Xinjiang Azadi uprising. They were not touched. This calculated movement, that the idea was to repeat something like Iraq in 1992. That Iran should be hit, it would be crippled, but it should not be killed. You see, this is it. Because for Americans, Iran, like for Israelis, Iran was the sacrificial lamb. It had to be sacrificed. But for Americans, when I refer to what George Gomben, he said that what cannot be eaten cannot be sacrificed. That's why pigs are never sacrificed. What cannot be eaten cannot be sacrificed. So this is the idea from American policy point of view, the idea that Iran was not Iraq, Iran was not Syria, and was not Afghanistan. Therefore, if leeway was given to Israel to deal with Iran militarily, there has to be a stopping point. It was not Trump's ingenious strategic reading of it, but I think this was the question which had already been decided. But this strategy worked out. Now in Iran, while there is a lot of change, but no difference on the surface. Now we come to this issue. I think that there are in Iran two sets of suspensions where the situation, the current situation has been suspended. It doesn't go forward, it doesn't come backwards. It is suspended. The first suspension is in the structure of power. And this suspension is, is the result of a serious and vehement power struggle which is going on in the power bloc in Iran between factions which are vying for dominance. In this power struggle, there are several issues around which this struggles revolve. One of them is the nuclear issue. You see Amargi is going and negotiating with the EU and Britain and says that delay the sanctions, the mechanism that brings back sanctions, and goes home. At home, they say that no negotiation. You see, you can see the story is completely suspended here. One is nuclear issue. The other one related to sanctions is the management of the economy, in which at the moment the fundamental issue basically is the oil revenue. Because there are no plans, no investments, nothing. Management the economy basically means how much oil revenue is coming in and how much it is spent and how it's spent. And this spending is not so much important for them, but this spending is basically spending in a rentier economy, which is organized around serious clientelist positions. So this is it. And then the other issue, and when I say there factionalism in there, you can imagine the formal government, which is run by Mr. Kurds. I just give you one example. There are in Iran 16 security apparatus. In Iran, 16 security apparatuses like meat in Turkey, but Iran has 16. Yeah. Of these 16 security apparatuses, only 2 are held by formal government. 14 of them are held by informal powers under Khamenei in parallel political organizations, which are created to bypass government. So you can imagine how vehement is this power struggle in Iran. 16 and the forces, which are basically called the resistance front. The resistance front basically is controlling under Khamenei's direct auspices and is his command in the in parallel governmental organizations which have been created to bypass the formal state. These guys are controlling these 14 apparatuses of security in the country, right? And this goes from both revolutionary, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to Basij to entire country where it has, for instance, in Kurdistan, in Sanandaj and Mahabad, there is a competition between the formal security structure which is run by the central government and that which is run by revolutionary guards. They arrest somebody, this one doesn't know, they arrest the other one if they don't know the other. But because they don't work with each other. They compete against each other. Now this is one side. The other issue in this power struggle, which is very important in this suspension, is the issue of succession, struggle to succeed Khamenei. This issue is in a very vehement struggle. Apparently, the Paidari, they want to oust the main candidate, which is Khamenei's son. They don't want it. And that has created an issue there. And here I go very quickly to another suspension. There is also a suspension in the civil society. Despite this revolutionary, despite this serious situation civil society has remained quiet. But why it has remained quiet, why there is this suspension, that's also another story, which I hope when we exchange ideas, I'll talk about. Thank you very much.
That's for two reasons. First, to stay away from the moderator. And second, I see many of you dozing off, so I need to give some energy to wake you all up. And it is, first of all, I would like to begin to congratulate the founding members on the launch of Amargi. It is an honor to be here today to celebrate this occasion with you all. It is actually both advantage and disadvantage to speak as the last panelist. Advantage because I have the opportunity, the option to deepen my thought and thinking and my talk by listening to all these thoughtful talks. I appreciate this. But it is disadvantage and challenge to say something meaningful and contribute meaningfully to this powerful, inspiring panel. Anyway, today my contribution to this panel will be how do power shifts or the current geopolitical recalibration affect democratization in the Middle East. This is a very broad question, and I speak broadly, but at the end I try to narrow my thought on this. To understand how the ongoing geopolitical recalibration impacts the prospect for democracy in the Middle East, we must first clarify two things. First, what do we mean by geopolitical recalibration? And second, what democracy entails. We live in a state-based world order, and we know that all. And from a Schmittian perspective, order is produced by formal distinction between friend and enemy, and by orientation around actual or potential conflicts. So, geopolitical recalibration means the realignment of alliances, the rearrangement of friends and enemy distinction. And where this geopolitical recalibration, how it unfolds, it's uncertain. I agree with both points that Dr. Cengiz Çandar and Professor Abbas Vali made. We are in a status of chaos, uncertainty in the Middle East. But what is clear is that we are facing an emerging world order shaped by multipolarity, climate change, demographic decline, and technological transformation. These are four broad factors that shaping this geopolitical recalibration. Particularly climate change has important, devastating, and at the same time some positive advantage for Middle East, which at the end I come back to this point. So, the question now is that to understand how this geopolitical recalibration will affect the balance of power, both between the states and among the states. Democracy, on the other hand, for me, is more than liberal form of representative democracy that is common in the developed world and which the US has aimed to export around the world to varying degrees of success since the end of the Second World War. There are many reasons why this American-led attempt has mostly failed in the Middle East. I again completely agree with what Dr. Çandar said. Middle East is a colonialist legacy from its very name, from its concept, geopolitically shaping structure, its borders. So that's one reason. But foremost, in my view, is the neglect of certain contextual realities and constraints in the Middle East. Liberal democracy typically requires some combination of economic growth, the development of a secular middle class, and that also necessitates being part of global capitalist economy and a culture based on methodological individualism that shaped liberalism, and to preparing the society for the idea of one person, one vote. These are requirements that do not quite match the regional, cultural, economic, and political realities. Yet, I believe this mismatch presents an opportunity, the chance not to adopt a mostly inapposite model of democracy, but to transcend it. The question, therefore, is not whether the Middle East will finally replicate Western democracy, but whether it can pioneer a more directly democratic ideal that challenges the way in which power is embedded and distributed in the liberal democratic system. Democratization, therefore, is not a one-way process that can simply be imported or exported. Rather, it is a contingent process of constant making and unmaking, dependent on historical, political, and economic and cultural conditions, and of course, geopolitical realities. It is a simultaneous process of both bottom-up and top-down democratization. Top-down democratization involves reforming authoritarian state institutions and dispersing power, while bottom-up democratization involves organizing and mobilizing civil society. Women's movement, Shilon elaborated on this thoughtfully and very extensively, and labor unions, national and ecological movements, and other grassroots initiatives, and developing a collective consciousness to challenge existing power structures and form a more directly democratic culture around social justice, gender emancipation, and ecological concern. In the Middle East, both processes are necessary for democracy to take root, both bottom-up and top-down democratization. It is a model that challenges, or has the potential to challenge, I would say, both local authoritarianism and political Islam in any various guises, as well as the very tendencies of the nation-state colonialist legacy that is entrenched within the Middle East. The key issue, after clarifying what do I mean by democratization and geopolitical recalibration, is thus how power shifts at both the global and regional levels will affect authoritarian regimes on the one hand and civil society on the other. In today's emerging world, we see what some scholars call liquid alliances. States form fluid, tactical, and pragmatic partnership based on immediate strategic interests rather than long-term ideological commitments. We can see that in the normalization of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, such as between Iran and Egypt. We can also see that as the Abraham Accords, and also the recent most current example is the relation between the Syrian head of the state, ex-Al-Qaeda member, with the West. It is very tactical. It is not based on long-term ideological commitment. What these liquid alliances is going to do is to bring opportunities and challenges to the region. They allow authoritarian regimes to survive by diversifying external supports during domestic or international crisis. It also creates what Daniel Bromberg calls an endless transition, a prolonged period of uncertainty that erodes trust, deepens instability, and makes system democratization more difficult, At the same time, such fluidity creates opportunities for non-state actors to forge cross-border alliance and challenge their respective regime, making states more fragile and giving oppositional groups more room to rise. We see that in the case of Kurdistan, for example. Alongside the phenomenon of liquid alliances, we must also consider other factors that help this authoritarian regime to endure their power and to stay in power. Among these are the persistence of rentier or oil-based economies and continued Western support for authoritarian regimes, the presence of political Islam in various forms, including extremist strains, the lack of coherent democratic opposition forces, and of course, Israel's growing regional hegemony is also a danger to this process. Taking all these factors, my point here is that authoritarianism, no matter what, no matter how this geopolitical recalibration unfolds, they always find a way to survive. However, two phenomena have the potential to challenge entrenched authoritarianism in the Middle East: climate change and grassroots mobilization. The latter includes movements like Cengiz Azadi, which mobilized large numbers of Kurds in at least 3 parts of Kurdistan, Turkey, Syria, and Iran. We recently marked its 3rd anniversary. It has shown this movement its potential not just as a protest movement, but as a model for further grassroots feminist and directly democratic political consciousness that builds transnational solidarity outside the framework of authoritarian state power. Climate change is so pivotal. It directly affects the Middle East and North Africa, a region already highly vulnerable in terms of security, food, and water. In many countries in the Middle East, particularly in countries like Iran, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, Egypt, and Iraq, we already see severe declines in water reserves. The impacts of drought will not be evenly distributed, however. Israel is widely recognized as a leader in water security and management, and the wealthy Arab Gulf countries can afford large-scale desalination. States most affected by water security, however, on the other hand, will face existential crisis, shortage of drinking water, agricultural collapse, and food insecurity. And this is already evident in countries like Iran, Iraq, and Syria. This condition will likely influence power shifts and the balance of power, both between and within Middle Eastern states. But that seems contradictory. How climate change that targets life can create an opportunity? What we describe here is a dystopia, apocalyptic. How that can create opportunity? I believe that climate change, together with other factors, can create what Chantal Mouffe calls a populist moment, an opening that can be co-opted by both right-wing and left-wing. Okay. So, but since we already see, I try to summarize it here, since we see the rise of women life freedom movement, Cengiz Azadi, in at least 3 parts of Kurdistan, that climate change is going to have the most impact. And we saw the impact of this movement in socializing, mobilizing, organizing the society. It can, or it has the potential to organize the society to use that populist moment. By doing this, it has also the potential to avoid the rise of political Islam. So, in short, I say that in a midterm image, we cannot imagine a democratic Middle East amid this geopolitical recalibration. However, we have a moment, and this moment is accompanied by a dystopia as well. How we can be prepared for that moment to avoid the reproduction of authoritarianism in the region is to organize the society. That's the only way that we can, when these already like authoritarian states are in crisis, a crisis that nobody can save them, it's climate change. Otherwise, they find a way. It doesn't matter how geopolitical recalibration, that friend's enemy will take place. It doesn't matter if Israel normalizes relationship with Iran. It doesn't matter if the Islamic Republic of Iran stays in power or not. Authoritarianism reproduces itself unless we have a conscious and empowered society. That's it. Thank you.